There are Qatar Airways planes parked in a desert in rural Spain, not because of a lack of passengers, not for scheduled maintenance, because there's no safe airspace left to fly through. But there's a detail nobody's talking about. These planes left Doha, the airport voted best in the world in 2024, exactly 1 year after completing the largest expansion in its history. 7 years of construction, capacity for 65 million passengers, opened in March 2025 with the group's CEO at the ceremony calling it a vital pillar of Qatar's growth. In February 2026, the airspace closed, the plane stopped, and the most modern terminal in the Middle East became one of the most dangerous places to be. So the question nobody's asking out loud is this: how did a country that spent decades mediating every conflict on the planet end up at the center of the biggest one?
أولاً بالنسبة للمطار أنا أؤكد أن هناك كان محاولات.
Qatar covers 11,000 square kilometers, smaller than the state of Connecticut. It has 3 million inhabitants, fewer than 400,000 of whom are Qatari nationals. It has no border with the Mediterranean, no relevant export industry, no domestic market that would justify a global hub. And yet, it moved 52.7 million passengers in 2024, a 15% increase over the previous year, more than Frankfurt Airport, more than any hub in the United States outside of Atlanta or Chicago. The model is brutally simple. You take a passenger leaving Dallas, bring them to Doha, and redistribute them to Bangkok, Nairobi, or Milan. Qatar Airways doesn't appear in the final destination of almost any of them. Most never even leave the terminal. This model worked for decades because Qatar had something no other hub possessed: the reputation of a country that doesn't take sides. Iran sent delegations. The United States maintained its largest military base in the Middle East just a few kilometers from the passenger terminal. But that neutrality had a silent threat built into it, the very war Qatar had always tried to prevent. Qatar spent decades building something no airport in the world had, an invisible shield made of diplomacy. And it worked until the moment it stopped working. Today we're going to understand how that shield was built, why it financially sustained the hub, and what happens to a 65 million passenger airport when the only thing protecting it disappears in a single week. What Qatar never disclosed in any report is that neutrality was part of the business model, not a separate foreign policy. Mechanism 1. The exclusive transit corridor. Doha's location is geometrically perfect for flights between Europe, Asia, and Africa. A passenger flying from New York to Mumbai covers roughly 7,300 miles nonstop, or stops in Doha with two shorter, cheaper legs to operate. Qatar Airways connects more than 160 global destinations from a single point. No airline in the world can replicate that density with direct flights. The hub-and-spoke model works like a spider web. Every new thread added increases the value of every existing one. Mechanism 2. Diplomacy as invisible infrastructure. Between 2006 and 2023, Qatar mediated negotiations between Palestine and Israel, between Afghan factions, between the US government and the Taliban. Every agreement brokered in Doha reinforced the perception that flying through Qatar meant flying over neutral ground. That reduced the perceived risk of operating in the Middle East and attracted carriers that would otherwise avoid the region entirely. Diplomacy wasn't separate from aviation, it was the hub's insurance policy. Mechanism 3. Non-aeronautical revenue. Hamad International isn't just a terminal, it's a high-volume retail operation. In 2024, Qatar Duty Free expanded by 29,000 square feet with the opening of the new concourses. Non-aeronautical revenue at hubs like Doha represents between 40% and 60% of total income. Every transit passenger spending 3 hours in the terminal spends an average of $40 to $80. With 52 million passengers a year, that number turns the airport into a retail business disguised as public infrastructure. This is not the first stress test of this model. In June 2017, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt simultaneously closed their airspace to Qatari aircraft. Overnight, Qatar Airways lost 18 destinations and was forced to reroute all its flights through Iranian airspace, adding up to an hour to routes that had previously been direct. The result, a nearly 9% decline in passenger numbers for the fiscal year ending March 2018, losses of hundreds of millions of dollars. In 2020, the airline launched international arbitration seeking at least $5 billion in compensation. Qatar survived because Iran kept its airspace open. Neutrality with Tehran was the lifeline that allowed the airline to redesign its routes and open 24 new destinations to replace the 18 it had lost. Now, in 2026, that lifeline became the source of the danger. And the stakes aren't just higher. The escape valve that saved the model in 2017 no longer exists. What Qatar did between 2017 and 2025 was an existential bet. It didn't retreat, it accelerated. The Hamad International expansion began in 2018 and was completed in March 2025, ahead of schedule. 17 new gates, a terminal covering 845,000 square meters, 14% larger than before. Capacity for 65 million passengers a year. The detail nobody noticed in the opening coverage. Inside the terminal, Qatar built a 65,000 square foot indoor tropical garden called the Orchard. It is the only tropical garden inside a terminal in the Arab world. The logic isn't aesthetic, it's strategic. In a market where Dubai, Singapore, and Abu Dhabi compete for the same transit passenger, the experience inside the terminal is part of the commercial argument for the route. But there's a number the inauguration ceremony never mentioned. Al Udeid Air Base, the largest U.S. military installation in the Middle East, housing 10,000 troops, sits just a few kilometers from the passenger terminal in a straight line. It is the closest major military base to the most ambitious commercial hub in the Middle East, and any missile or drone with an imprecise trajectory toward Al Udeid crosses directly over the approach corridor of Hamad International. The vulnerability of this bet was on the map from day one. Nobody wanted to read it. On February 28, 2026, Iran launched 65 missiles and 12 drones toward Qatar. Most were intercepted, but 16 people were wounded by shrapnel on the streets of Doha. On March 3rd, an Iranian ballistic missile broke through air defenses and struck Al Udeid directly, passing over the airport. 2 days before that impact, 2 Iranian Su-24 bombers flying at less than 100 feet of altitude were shot down by the Qatari Air Force 2 minutes from their target. 2 minutes.
Emergency alert
that was
system,
the margin that
everyone on their
separated
phones.
the largest attack on a U.S. base in the Middle East from a potential catastrophe directly above Hamad International's approach corridor. Dubai's airport was also hit during this period. An Iranian drone ignited a fuel tank at Terminal 3 of DXB in March, forcing evacuation and flight diversions. Emirates also stopped flying, but Dubai restored more than 350 daily flights, while Doha remained at 43. The difference isn't geographic, it's structural. Dubai doesn't have a U.S. military base a few kilometers from its terminal. Qatar does, and as long as Al Udeid remains a priority target for Iran, Doha's airspace will continue to be treated by international carriers as a risk zone, regardless of what happens to the civilian terminal. The neutrality that protected the hub no longer exists. What exists is a tropical garden called the Orchard, a few kilometers from a base at war. Qatar bet everything on a foundation it didn't control. It built the world's best airport on the premise that it would always be the place where enemies tolerated each other. When that premise collapsed, it collapsed together with the airspace, the routes, and the planes that ended up in a desert in Spain. There is no documented plan B. There are planes in storage, an empty terminal with capacity for 65 million people, and an airline operating at 32% of its normal capacity. The question that remains is deeper than the war itself. When and if the conflict ends, can Qatar rebuild the neutrality that took decades to establish? Or will the world's most modern hub reopen in a landscape where nobody believes Doha is neutral ground anymore? If you want to understand the real money moving global aviation, subscribe for more analysis. Until next time.